This image from the Attica prison uprising in September 1971.
Subscribe before the truth gets buried, like the files that disappeared, like the footage no one was supposed to see. And comment below, because once you hear this, you'll have questions too. The prison riot that changed everything, but still doesn't add up. The gunfire had already stopped by the time the fog began to lift over Attica Correctional Facility. Smoke hung low across the yard, clinging to the concrete like it didn't know where else to go. Men lay face down where they'd been ordered to lie, hands behind their heads, voices silent except for coughing and prayer. The prison had been retaken, but whatever really happened inside those walls was only beginning to surface. This was September 13, 1971. And nothing about Attica would ever be simple again. Just 4 days earlier, the prison had exploded into chaos, but not the kind people imagine. There was no single spark, no lone ringleaders screaming for blood. Instead, it began quietly. A shove during a routine escort. A door closed too hard. A grievance ignored, like so many before it. Inside Attica, overcrowded cells, broken sanitation, racial tension, and a near-total lack of basic rights had been building pressure for years. Then, suddenly, the pressure broke. By the morning of September 9th, inmates had seized control of a section of the prison known as D-Yard. Guards were taken hostage. Makeshift barricades went up. And for the first time, the men inside Attica weren't whispering their complaints. They were broadcasting them. Outside the walls, state officials scrambled. New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller was briefed repeatedly. State troopers, corrections officers, and National Guard units surrounded the prison. Negotiators were brought in. Reporters arrived. Cameras rolled. What unfolded over the next 4 days would be watched by the entire nation. In the yard, inmate representatives organized themselves with startling discipline. They drafted a list of demands, many of them basic: medical care, fair wages for prison labor, religious freedom, an end to racial abuse. They invited observers, including lawyers, journalists, and public figures, to witness negotiations firsthand. For a moment, it looked like a standoff that might end without catastrophe. But beneath the surface, something wasn't lining up. Internal communications between prison officials were inconsistent. Timelines shifted. Orders were issued, then quietly walked back. Some negotiators later claimed progress was being made. Others insisted the situation was spiraling out of control. And behind closed doors, pressure mounted to end the uprising, by force if necessary. Inside Attica, the hostages were alive. That much was confirmed repeatedly. Inmates allowed them to speak to observers. Some guards even described being protected from harm. Yet outside the walls, rumors began spreading. Rumors of executions, of knives, of chaos beyond repair. Those rumors mattered, because on the morning of September 13th, Governor Rockefeller authorized a retaking of the prison. What followed lasted less than an hour. State troopers stormed Attica under a blanket of tear gas. Gunfire erupted. When it was over, dozens of people were dead, both inmates and hostages. The official explanation came quickly. Hostages had been killed by inmates during the riot. But within days, that story began to crack. Autopsy reports revealed something impossible to ignore. The hostages had not been killed by inmate weapons. They had died from gunshot wounds, shots fired during the retaking. The very operation meant to restore order had caused the majority of the deaths. That revelation shook the country. Investigations were launched. Hearings were held. Testimony was taken under oath. And yet, the deeper investigators dug, the more the story blurred instead of sharpening. Evidence went missing. Statements conflicted. Some witnesses recanted. Others claimed they were pressured into silence. One investigator later described Attica not as a single event, but as layers of decisions stacked on top of each other, each one hiding the one below it. Why were negotiators sidelined when talks appeared ongoing? Why were lethal weapons used when hostages were still present? Why did official reports initially misrepresent the causes of death? And perhaps most unsettling of all, who knew what and when? For years, the narrative focused on the riot itself. But what happened after the gates were retaken raised just as many questions. Inmates reported severe reprisals. Guards were accused of coordinated retaliation. Prosecutors pursued charges almost exclusively against inmates, while state actors largely avoided accountability. It would take decades for some victims' families to receive official acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Even then, many felt justice had only been partially served. Attica became a symbol of prison reform, of state power, of how easily truth can fracture under pressure. But symbols have a way of simplifying things. And Attica was anything but simple, because when you line up the timelines, the communications, the autopsy reports, and the testimony, there are gaps that still don't close. Decisions that still don't fully make sense. Moments where the official version of events collides head-on with documented facts. And buried within those gaps is the reason Attica is still debated today. Not because it was violent, not because it was tragic, but because even after all these years, no one can say with absolute certainty that the full truth ever came out. And when investigators later reopened sealed files no one expected to still exist, what they found would raise a question that still echoes through American criminal justice. Was Attica a riot that got out of control? Or a crisis that was never meant to end any other way? Because when they finally examined one overlooked communication log from the final night, one message that never made it into the official record, it suggested something far more disturbing. And that discovery is where the story truly begins. The version that survived. The communication log surfaced quietly decades after Attica faded from the front pages. It wasn't found in a dramatic raid or a whistleblower's press conference. It appeared during a routine archival review, buried in a box mislabeled with the wrong year. A single page, time-stamped, initialed, and it didn't match the official story. According to public records, negotiations at Attica had completely collapsed by the night of September 12, 1971. Officials claimed inmates were becoming increasingly unreasonable, that hostages were in imminent danger, and that force was the only remaining option. That version justified what came next. But the recovered log told a different story. Late that night, hours before the retaking, there was still active communication between inmate representatives and state negotiators. Not chaotic, not threatening, structured. The language suggested concessions were being discussed, not abandoned. Medical access, outside oversight, a pause to reassess. Someone had been talking. The question was why no one outside Attica was ever told. As investigators revisited the uprising with this new piece of evidence, they noticed something else that had been hiding in plain sight for years. The timeline most people accepted had been built backward, not forward. The outcome came first. The justification followed. Witness testimony from observers inside the prison described a tense but controlled atmosphere in D-Yard. Hostages were still alive. Some were even allowed to move freely under inmate protection. Journalists present later recalled being surprised by the level of organization among inmates, how quickly rumors of chaos seemed to spread outside, even when nothing had changed inside. Those rumors didn't come from nowhere. Radio traffic from state police units surrounding Attica showed repeated references to extreme violence that could not be corroborated by anyone inside the yard. Claims of hostage harm were transmitted, repeated, and amplified. Each repetition made the situation seem more urgent, more dangerous, more final. Once that narrative took hold, it became difficult to reverse. Governor Rockefeller's role has been debated for decades. He never entered the prison. He never spoke directly with inmate representatives. Decisions were made through intermediaries, filtered through reports that may already have been shaped by fear and political pressure. At the time, Rockefeller was considered a potential presidential contender. Appearing weak during a prison uprising was not an option he was willing to entertain. But politics alone doesn't explain everything. Investigators began asking harder questions. Why were negotiators who favored continued dialogue sidelined? Why were tactical units briefed with information later proven false? Why did early official statements insist hostages had been killed by inmates, even after medical evidence contradicted that claim? One former state official, interviewed years later, described the moment after the retaking as a scramble to control the narrative. He said it wasn't about covering up a single decision, but about preventing the collapse of institutional trust. If the public understood how many assumptions were wrong, he said, they'd never believe another official statement again. Inside Attica, the aftermath was brutal in ways that rarely made it into early reports. Inmates were searched, questioned, and punished en masse. Some alleged abuse, some alleged forced confessions. Many claims were dismissed as unreliable, coming from men already labeled criminals. But over time, patterns emerged. Similar stories told by people who never met. Medical records that didn't align with official incident reports. Photographs that contradicted sworn testimony. Still, prosecutions moved in only one direction. Dozens of inmates were charged. Years passed. Trials dragged on. Evidence fell apart under scrutiny. Eventually, most cases were dismissed. Not because innocence was proven, but because the state could not meet its burden of proof. Meanwhile, no state trooper or official was criminally convicted for actions taken during the retaking. That imbalance haunted Attica's legacy. The communication log added another layer to the mystery. If negotiations were ongoing, then the urgency that justified immediate force was at least partly manufactured. And if that urgency was manufactured, then the retaking wasn't the last resort it was claimed to be. It was a choice. Investigators traced the log's origin and discovered it had been routed through an internal channel that bypassed standard reporting procedures. It was seen by a small group of officials, and then effectively disappeared. No follow-up, no acknowledgement, no inclusion in final briefings. Someone had decided it wasn't relevant. As more documents were reviewed, it became clear that Attica had produced not one record, but several parallel records, each telling a slightly different story depending on who was meant to read it. Public statements emphasized disorder. Internal memos emphasized control. Legal filings emphasized uncertainty. Truth was fractured into versions. Families of the dead spent decades searching for answers. Some accepted settlements from the state, agreements that came with no admission of wrongdoing. Others refused, believing acknowledgement mattered more than compensation. One family member summed it up years later, "We weren't asking for perfection. We were asking for honesty." Attica forced reforms. Prison conditions improved. Oversight increased. Training changed. On paper, the system learned. But the unresolved questions never went away. Why was force chosen at that exact moment? Why were incorrect claims allowed to stand for so long? Why did accountability stop at the prison gates? And perhaps most troubling, what precedent did Attica set for how crises are handled when transparency becomes inconvenient? The deeper investigators looked, the clearer it became that Attica wasn't just a prison riot. It was a stress test for power under pressure. And power, when threatened, does not always choose truth. As one legal scholar later wrote, Attica taught the state how to survive its own mistakes. But survival isn't the same as resolution, because when a final review committee attempted to reconstruct the decision-making chain, who authorized what, based on which information, they hit a wall. A missing segment, a gap of 27 minutes during the early morning hours of September 13th. No recordings. No notes, no testimony that aligned, just silence. And that silence would become the most disturbing evidence of all. Because if those 27 minutes were ever fully explained, they might answer the question everyone still avoids. Not what happened at Attica, but why it happened exactly when it did. The minutes no one claimed. The 27 missing minutes sat at the center of Attica like a sealed room no one wanted to open. Every investigation eventually reached it. Every timeline bent around it. The clocks disagreed. Radios fell silent. Men who testified with confidence about everything else suddenly couldn't remember where they were or who they spoke to. It wasn't just that records were incomplete. It was that the absence was consistent. Committees tried to reconstruct the gap using fragments. A trooper's wristwatch time-stamped a movement that should have required an order. A negotiator's handwritten note referenced a call that, officially, never happened. A helicopter pilot recalled being told to hold position, and then, minutes later, being told the opposite, without remembering who issued either instruction. The pieces fit only one way if you allowed for an uncomfortable conclusion. Decisions were made during those minutes that no one wanted attached to their name. Years later, a retired state official agreed to speak on background. He didn't deny the gap. He explained it. When things tip from management to crisis, he said, authority compresses. Fewer people make bigger calls. And once force is chosen, the paperwork catches up later. In other words, the record followed the action, not the other way around. That explanation aligned with what families of the dead had suspected all along. That Attica didn't end in chaos because control was lost, but because control was reasserted in the fastest way possible. And once that happened, the narrative had to be stabilized before the truth could destabilize everything else. The stabilization came quickly. Early press briefings repeated the claim that hostages had been killed by inmates. It was said with certainty. It was wrong. When autopsies proved it, officials didn't retract the statements immediately. They reframed them. Confusion, fog of crisis, miscommunication. The story shifted just enough to survive. Internal memos from the weeks after the retaking reveal a priority that wasn't public safety or accountability, but cohesion. There was concern, explicitly stated, that prosecuting state actors would damage morale across law enforcement and corrections nationwide. That fear became policy. Instead, the legal system turned inward. Inmates were charged en masse. Evidence was thin. Witnesses contradicted one another. Trials collapsed. Years later, the state quietly abandoned most cases. Not because innocence had been established, but because continuing would expose too much. Meanwhile, survivors, guards, and inmates alike lived with what they'd seen. One former correctional officer described it as carrying two versions of the same memory. The official one, repeated in reports and interviews, and the private one, replayed at night, where orders came faster than explanations and no one asked the questions that mattered. For decades, Attica sat in that unresolved space. Cited, argued, a warning and a symbol at the same time. Then, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, something unexpected happened. Civil lawsuits forced the state to open files it had never planned to share. Depositions were taken. Documents were released. Not everything, but enough. Among them was a draft memorandum dated September 13, 1971, time-stamped within the missing window. It wasn't signed. It outlined a transition from negotiation to tactical response. The language was clinical. It referenced acceptable risk and anticipated outcomes. It did not mention hostages by name. It treated the yard as a problem to be resolved, not a space full of people. The memo wasn't definitive proof of intent, but it showed mindset. And once that mindset was visible, many earlier decisions made sense. Negotiations stalled not because they failed, but because they no longer mattered. Communication logs vanished not because of incompetence, but because they complicated the rationale. The initial false claims about hostage deaths weren't random. They preempted the most damaging question of all. Why was lethal force used when other options still existed? When the state eventually settled with victims' families, it did so without admitting liability. The language was careful. Regret without responsibility. Closure without clarity. For some families, it was enough. For others, it confirmed their worst fear, that Attica had been managed as a reputational crisis, not a human one. Today, Attica is taught in criminal justice programs as a turning point, a catalyst for reform, a lesson in what happens when conditions deteriorate and communication fails. But that framing still avoids the hardest truth. Attica didn't change everything because it exposed prison conditions. It changed everything because it revealed how institutions behave when their authority is challenged in public. How quickly narratives harden. How easily silence becomes policy. The riot itself lasted days. The retaking lasted minutes. The consequences have lasted more than half a century, and the 27 minutes remain unclaimed. No one has ever officially explained them. No definitive record has surfaced. No testimony has closed the gap. What exists instead is inference, pattern, alignment, The same tools investigators use when the truth won't come forward on its own. Put together, they suggest that Attica wasn't an unavoidable tragedy. It was a preventable one, made inevitable by choices that could not be defended in daylight. That is why Attica still doesn't add up. Not because we lack information, but because we know enough to understand what was avoided. And if you think this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it.